And thank you for inviting me. It's a great privilege and pleasure to speak to you on Shevchenko, and especially this bicentennial year from his birth. And today I will talk about the effects of reading Shevchenko. We are not going to read Shevchenko because you have to do it in Ukrainian. Translations are difficult to grasp and difficult to present in such a way to give full dimension to Shevchenko's work. But I'll look at instances and effects and contexts in which Shevchenko emerged as a writer, and effects he had as a poet on his immediate environment, upon his public. And some of these effects I'll also discuss in the context of today's Ukraine, the context of Maidan and treatments of Shevchenko in visual arts and popular arts today. And before we talked about Shevchenko, I thought we would look at several contexts of sort of the time and place where he appeared, and what it means for that particular point in time, late 1830s, early 1840s, when he published his Kobzar in 1840, and what it did to the Ukrainian public, how it was received in the Russian imperial context, cultural context, and what came after all that. And of course, all of us can look up Wikipedia and look at Shevchenko, and we'll get the basics of his biography, but I would like to look a little bit broader even, and see how he fits into what is the emergence of Ukrainian cultural national identity in modern romantic period that is a early 19th century. And as we all know, so Shevchenko, let's see if we can, this blue arrow points to the place where he was born. What it means, or what it tells us, he is born in the right bank Ukraine. Right bank, left bank. Left bank Ukraine is the Cossack Hetmanate Ukraine that was integrated into Russian Empire in the late 18th century. Right bank Ukraine was integrated into Russian Empire as a result of partitions of Poland. So these territories became Russian Empire in the late 18th century, after 3 partitions of Poland. And that means that Shevchenko did not belong to the traditional Cossack gentry, Cossack elites that became part of Russian hereditary gentry. He is from a different milieu. He's special, quote unquote. He was born in the village of Morenci, which also is connected to the massive uprising of Haidamaki, that is Koliyivshchina, in 1780s, that was suppressed by the Tsarist and Polish armies. And again, Shevchenko himself, of course, is removed from it, but he reportedly heard these stories. He heard these stories of terrible violence from his grandfather as he grew up in Morenci. And these memories then, combined with his readings of sources and romantic literature, Polish literature in particular, resulted in his Haidamaki, his version of what happened then. As we all know, he was born a serf, was an orphan, and became a lackey to his master, and with whom he traveled to Vilna, which would be Lithuanian territories, on the way to Petersburg, where he continued to study visual arts and was geared to become one of those privately owned artists for landowner Engelgard. But in Petersburg he he met several Ukrainian intellectuals, intelligentsia, Shevchenko. Some of them were artists, some of them were literary, and this is how this story of his transformation from a serf to an artist and poet began. Due to efforts of his friends and efforts of Karl Brylov and the court poet Vasily Zhukovsky, he was bought out from serfdom for the fairly hefty amount of 2,500 rubles, an equivalent, I don't know, of a good quality cart, that is kareta. So compare it to a modern middle-level car. That was the price of a serf with skills at the time, in the 1830s. He was bought out from serfdom and released from his bonds and became a free man, entering Petersburg Academy of Arts. And this is where he takes off. This is how he becomes Shevchenko that we know today. And if you look at where he fits, 1830s, and if you look at what was going on in Ukrainian society, in Ukrainian territories, in the previous generations, so the approximately, and this is something that he would certainly be aware of, because this is part of narratives, this is part of memory not that far removed, the memory of Mazepa and Poltava, the fateful decision of Hetman Mazepa to align himself against Peter the Great, and his the defeat of Charles XII, leading to waves of terror and destruction in Cossack Ukraine, and eventually leading to the destruction of Cossack Hetmanate, the processes of encirclement, again the Kolyivshchina or Haidamaki uprising, the destruction of Zaporozhye and Sich. The entire 18th century is the century of defeats for Ukrainian society, polity, and toward the end of the 18th century, the last step into this, in that process of integration of Cossack Ukraine, former Cossack Ukraine, in the Russian Empire, was the admission of Cossack elites, not all, but many, those who could produce documents of their noble estate, granted either by Polish kings or by Ukrainian hetmans, their admission to the ranks of Russian hereditary gentry. That meant that they became the same as Russian noblemen, which was crucial for this group of possibly 20,000 noblemen. And as 20,000 of Cossack descendants of Cossack elites became hereditary noblemen of the Russian Empire, they had to configure what to do next, what to do there, how to find their path, their ways, and how to use this position to their own advantage, of course. And there were various ways, of course. Ukrainians, many of those descendants of Cossack elites, went to look for careers in Petersburg or in Moscow, because the local institutions were transformed and there were no more Ukrainian local institutions as they were in the Cossack Hetmanate, so they were looking for opportunities elsewhere. In some cases, such as in Kharkiv, local elites and intelligentsia on grassroots basis organized the creation of the first Ukrainian university, even though there were earlier initiatives to create a university, so a modern university, not Kiev-Mohyla type institution. And in 1805, due to their efforts, Kharkiv University came to being and became one of the important centers of intellectual and creative activities. So that's the historical context, as this is where Ukrainian Romanticism takes off, from Kharkiv and from those who, between 1805 and 1815, it takes about 10 years, and then suddenly you have a journal, you have circles of interested people looking for folklore, collecting documents, publishing them, and trying their literary abilities as well. If you look at generations of Ukrainian intelligentsia, again, we'll see representatives of older generations, Ivan Kotlяревsky being the father of Ukrainian literature in vernacular with his Eneida, who grew up or still remembered Cossack Hetmanate quite vividly. And But from the early 19th century onwards, we have those newly nobilitated members of Cossack elites, who are now gentry, who also try their careers in the new imperial context and become educators, writers, intellectuals, and so on. Shevchenko belongs to the third wave, the third generation, along with Kostomarov, Kulish, Rybinka, those who were born after 1810, that is at the time of Napoleonic Wars. So he fits into this third generation of Ukrainian intelligentsia. And of course, we'll also remember that during this time, the historical memory of traumatic events, that is, Napoleonic Wars, Decembrists, Polish uprising, were also quite present in the minds and imaginations and memories of the public. If you look at what was happening with Ukraine at the time, again, I'll really be very brief because we don't have time to explain everything, but what I see, what is happening in the first decades of the 19th century, I see it as emergence of romantic Ukraine, as a romantic nation, organically imagined, as a being that evolves, that is organically connected with its past, with its folklore, with its historical tradition, and it replaces the earlier understanding of what Ukraine is as an estate, as a Cossack noble estate. So Cossacks, the interest toward Cossacks, their narrative, the Historia Rusov, or history of the Rus people narrative that extols the nobility, the liberties, the social status, noble status of the Cossacks, all that is replaced with a different understanding of a nation as a romantic, organic entity. And it focuses and emphasizes the connection between history, language, way of being, customs, and lore. And we see this process reflected in products that belong to Ukrainian discourse. It's very syncretic. You have projects that belong to different fields. We see publications in Ukrainian vernacular starting with Kotlяревsky's Aeneida. We see the first grammar of Ukrainian language produced in the late 18th century, published in 1818. We see the first collection of Ukrainian folklore published. Historical narrative of Ukraine, from Kamensky to Markevich. We see scholarship produced in Russian, but scholarship that focuses on aspects either of literary history or folklore that positions Ukrainian material in a privileged way, in a central way, within these projects, such as Bodyansky or Kostomarov. And we see literary enterprises, almanacs, even Gogol's Dikhanka stories. It's an attempt to capitalize on the interest within imperial center toward Ukrainian history, customs, traditions, slightly exotic, slightly comical, but nonetheless very colorful. And what Gogol does, he looks at this Ukrainian fashion in Petersburg, and I would add that this fashion was also stimulated by Ukrainians themselves in the late 18th, early 19th century, and he repackages it as Dikhanka stories, collections that become exceptionally popular and entertaining both in the capitals of the Russian Empire and in Ukraine. And we see various publications in Ukrainian that appear throughout the 1830s. This is not a perfect chart, but it illustrates the evolution. Again, it's quite, you look at it, it's fairly modest, but we see how the Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian discourse is shaped throughout 1830s and 40s. Several books, and again, it's not comprehensive. I was trying to pull out data from wherever I can, and of course the most difficult part is to look at texts that belong to Ukrainian discourse, but actually are produced in Russian. Because many Ukrainians living, whether in Moscow or Petersburg, would write their text in Russian. But what makes these texts participate or reflect Ukrainian discourse or Ukrainian position is something that we can call habitus, or set of predispositions, or worldview. That is, the text that, while fitting into Russian literary fashion and satisfying needs, explaining what happened in Ukrainian history, nonetheless reflect views or sentiments or nostalgia which is Ukrainian. And this is the notion that still needs to be fully explored and understand, because you can have texts like history of the Rus people, Historia Rusa, a text written probably after 1810s, which is written in perfectly literary Russian, not even archaic, even though the text pretends to be a chronicle from the earlier 18th century, earlier times. And basically, while on the surface this text adheres to the main ideology of what Russian narrative is supposed to be, the narrative of integration of Ukraine and Russia. At the same time, this same text contains elements either as quotations or as certain connections, not blaming Peter the Great, but blaming Menshikov, that go contrary to this surface narrative that you find in it. So basically, the same text can contain two opposite messages. The one that adheres to what Russian imperial eye, if I can use this metaphor, demands of Ukrainian discourse, and at the same time containing a message or an opinion which is opposite to it. And you find it in Historia Rusi for sure, especially if you look at the treatment of Mazepa, which has to be treated as a villain, and yet Mazepa is quoted, and his speech at the time of defection and changing his alliance from Peter to Charles XII is quite poignant. So this is the situation in which Ukrainians had to navigate. They had to position themselves, produce their texts in such a way that they would be part of mainstream, imperial mainstream, that they would be in demand, they would be published, that would go through censorship, and at the same time they would express sentiments, opinions, predispositions, points of view that were their own, and at times that they would be in direct or indirect conflict with that surface official point of view. And again, this is not too surprising. It's not even too schizophrenic, I would say, because every person has roles and various identities, situational identities that are adjusted to a particular situation. And the same writer could talk about the glory of an imperial parade in Petersburg, as Hrabinka writes to his parents. He's really impressed with His Majesty marching there. On the other hand, he could talk about those Russians or Ukrainians who bash Ukrainian language in very negative terms and use certain ethnic stereotypes. Shevchenko, so that is the situation. That is normal, quote unquote, and it is part of what is called mimicry, the ways of adjustment and coping with a particular situation that most Ukrainian writers, intellectuals used at the time. And it's difficult to fully grasp because we don't know what they talked about among themselves. We know what they published, and we can distinguish certain layers in what they published, but it's not always that we get a glimpse to their private sphere, that is, what they volunteer not to say out loud or in the face of authorities. Ukrainian publishing and book printing, generally speaking, in 1830s, 1840s, book printing just emerged as a full-scope commercial activity in the Russian Empire. And starting from the mid-1830s, books were published in fairly sizable print runs of about 1,200. And that would be reasonable, that would be sizable. Now, this is for the Russian Empire. But books are not what books are today. Books are objects of luxury. Books are expensive. Books could cost 10 rubles. If Akaki Akakevich, Gogol's character, if his salary is 400 rubles, you don't buy books very often. So books are for special groups of people who can afford them. And of course, Ukrainian books have even smaller audience, and therefore the print runs of early Ukrainian publications are quite small. We are talking about 200 copies of a Ukrainian almanac, for example. The first vernacular Aeneida, probably in the late 18th century, probably was printed in the print run of about 200 copies. Shevchenko's Kobzar, already in 1840, was printed in a regular print run of 1200, although some sources tell us it's 1000, but I think it was just a standard 1200 print run. And his second Haidomaki had a smaller one, and it wasn't. Kobzar was a big success. Kobzar quickly was absorbed and purchased by Ukrainian elites, and with the success of this first book, Shevchenko produced another edition and published Haidomaki. But Haidomaki, his romantic poem of drastic, bloody events of the peasant and Cossack uprising, did not fare as well, and it was later rebound and together with Kobzar and produced as a Cheherinsky Kobzar and Haidomaki together, with probably 800 copies or something like that. So we have the situation where there is a commercial progress, commercial exploitation of the phenomenon of literature, literary professionalization, publishing, and now Russian writer, Russian critic, Russian editor can actually make a living by being a literateur. In Ukrainian context, it's much more difficult, and therefore it takes a while, and it takes a lot of effort and a lot of organization on the part of these members of Ukrainian intelligentsia to put together, to organize their circles, their publications, and each of them is in its own way programmatic. If you look at these first almanacs, each of them is a corpus of what's available, what we have to look at and cherish. And this is the environment of a very closely knit, protective group of literateurs and critics. So this brings us closer to the notion of Ukrainian readers, Ukrainian audience. Who are they? Some information about these readers we can get from Shevchenko himself, from some of his tales, from some of his letters. For example, in his tale, The Twins, Bliznytsi, the Cossack sotnik, or major, roughly equivalent Nikifor Sokira, is educated at home by a priest who is educated at Kiev Mohyla, and Nikifor Sokira has inherited it and keeps at his home several fancy, expensive editions that he got from his father. And his father belonged to Cossack elites. And among these books, among these publications, we find Horace, Virgil, and Homer in the original, French encyclopedia, manuscript by Archbishop Koznarsky, but not necessarily history of the Rus people. Sokira knows and admires folk songs and comments on Skovoroda, Shakhovskoy, and Kotlяревsky. These latter works he didn't have as books. These are 19th century publications, but he must have known them either from performances, Natalka Poltavka, or borrowed manuscripts. Kotlяревsky's Ode to Prince Kurakin, it was an Aeneid. And at one point, the narrator even comes to his friend Sokira with a copy of Ukrainian Vesnik, Ukrainsky Vesnik, an early Kharkiv magazine published between 1816 and 1819. And two friends read a translation or travesty by Vlad Artemovsky from Horace. And so Kira is able to compare it with the original Horace and comment on the propriety and precision in Vlad Artemovsky's Ukrainian rendering. However, his adopted sons belong already to a different generation, and they subscribe to mainstream imperial productions, such as journal Отечественные записки. They hope to subscribe to more periodicals, such as Современник, and these are realia of the newer generation. While the newer generation is drawn to the mainstream, Ukrainian native publications still hold for them significant interest. And we have sufficient evidence that indicates how Ukrainians living in Petersburg or in the territories of Ukraine were seeking out books on Ukraine or in Ukrainian. Why? What are they looking for in these books? One answer, one glimpse to an answer we can derive from Andrei Storozhenko, or a person who published under the pseudonym Tsarenny, a resident of Petersburg, who produced a review of Gogol's Dikanka stories. So, all started with him reading announcements and positive reviews. So he read about it, he realized this is about Ukraine, and then it stimulated him to seek out and purchase this book, even though it's an expenditure. And then, after reading it, he produces his own long critique in the journal Сын Отечества about the identity of the book and its author. And Storozhenko in his review, even though it's often overlooked as too lengthy, too ethnographic, I am of slightly different opinion about Storozhenko. He emerges as an avid reader of literature. He is able to appreciate Pushkin, Walter Scott, but for him, Ukrainian book is especially dear. And I quote, "I am a little Russian. I love my motherland and love to hear the tales of our rich antiquity. Songs, fairy tales, and fables immerse me in pleasant thoughts, and my imagination then paints figures of mustached ancestors together with blind bards who sing of heroic deeds and tellers of the real and fantastic. The songs reflect the character of the people or nation, and the tales, its customs and superstitions." End of quote. Storozhenko's review, in fact, emerges as a discerning overview of the corpus of available Ukrainian literature produced in Ukrainian and Russian as of 1832. In Storozhenko, we observe the special pleasure that an educated Ukrainian derives from reading about his native land and its people, but also a demand for an adequate and dignified depiction of Ukraine's past and national physiognomy, aspects connected to the author's choice and quality of language, point of view, historical perspective, and ethnographic expertise. Storozhenko's review of Gogol allows us to discern the modalities of Ukrainian reading, reading with the Ukrainian spin that characterize a special relationship between the Ukrainian literati and their projected public, multiple audiences possible, often internalized in the Ukrainian discourse itself, special functions of Ukrainian literary product, and their peculiar position in the larger field of imperial book culture. In this context of Gogol, the Ukrainian fashion, and in the context of Romantic era Ukrainian reading, can be characterized as a cluster of overlapping expectations and experiences. And I charted it approximately like this. So this is what reading means and stands for Ukrainians such as Storozhenko and quite a few others. Naturally, reading is always a satisfaction of cultural needs in any society, any polity. And this is self-evident. With Ukrainian spin, this satisfaction for reading Ukrainian product brings additional pleasure. That is, reading your own, about your own past, your own ancestors, And this pleasure is often compared to reading, to eating and dreaming. That is, these pleasurable, dreamy activities. The eating aspect is also connected to the tradition of Kotlяревщина, that is the comical in grotesque, playful way of establishing intimate audience, where, like in Dikanka stories, in the introduction, there's a group of narrators, everyone gathered to listen and tell stories, and this is this intimate group of oral storytelling that is projected as the most organic, living, desirable way of experiencing, as opposed to, and Gogol makes it directly, as he pokes fun of imperial balls for stilted entertainments compared to this natural, pleasant entertainment with food and dances and merriment. And by doing it, the producers of this Ukrainian word and readers imagine themselves as intimate field, intimate group of our reading community, of abundance and fun. This reading as a common fun or meal helps neutralize and exclude the threatening other that denies the local world any cultural authority. Hrebinka, Yevhen Hrebinka, who was the schoolmate of Gogol and publisher of Ukrainian almanac Lastivka Swallowed in 1841, where Shevchenko was also featured, included an excerpt from Shevchenko's poem Haidamake in this almanac, with his jocular editorial comment, and I quote, "What a nice piece, very nice, so tasty, like some nice watermelon after supper on a hot day. You eat it and want still more. You read and keep reading. Here's, for example, the first chapter." End of quote, and this is the end of his comment. Now, how do you compare Haidamake with its topics and drama and old biblical revenge and everything with the melon? Well, if you recall Gogol's own treatment of Pushkin in Arabesque, where he compared great Russian poet to a subtle dish of little birdie that only a most sophisticated connoisseur could appreciate, you would then appreciate, of course with a sense of irony, Hrebinka's funny editorializing comment on Haidamake as a melon. Kvitka Osnovyanenko, a Ukrainian writer of older generation and kulturträger, also wrote in a letter to Shevchenko about the tasty treat of Haidamake, although without melons. In other words, the tastiness of the native word is a traditional trope meant to contrast it with the inedible, inauthentic metropolitan discourse, both in terms of books and criticism that offers no food, no benefit to Ukrainian reader. Again, it's a way of constructing your own and projecting, making boundaries with the other that is common in Ukrainian criticism and literature of the time. However, the Masque of a Rustic Bumpkin, consumer of Ukrainian literature, common in the late 20s, 1830s, was refuted by Shevchenko himself as he shaped his voice and persona of Kozar, bard, and it becomes especially clear in his unpublished introduction to 1847 edition of Kozar. Some of Shevchenko's readers, however, did feel the impropriety of these watermelon comparisons and affected gestures of Ukrainian literary discourse. One of his readers, writing a letter to the bard, Philip Korolyov, a teacher of physics in Kharkiv, who admired Shevchenko, wrote the following: "Brother, may I call you so, because I fell in love with you like a brother, and even more, as you were the first to sing about the Cossack glory, loud and true, like God's word, about past liberty, about the Ukrainian steppe and grave mounds, not about a melon, as if all there is in Ukraine are melons and horseradish." Korolyov's urge to address the poet as brother brings us to the second, more serious and important mode of reading Shevchenko, communion. So reading as an emotional communion and catharsis. Reading in the native tone is commonly associated with a deeply emotional, cathartic state that brings together the subject, poet, and the audience. Sometimes this catharsis seems to be envisioned or even predicted in advance, as in Pete Koznarsky's editorial address in the Almanac Utrymnie Zvezda in 1833, where he says, "Let Mr. Hrebinka Hrebionkin publish Poltava, he is currently translating from Russian, and there will be something that, whether you want it or not, something that will touch your heart, will ache, and your heart will ache, and there will be a moment when, while reading, your tears would involuntarily flow from your eyes." End of quote. This mode of receiving the native word through the heart, through tender emotion and tears, is characteristic for Ukrainian literati who from the late 1820s strove to dispel the association of Ukrainian language with the low comical register of travesty, joke, and anecdote that had been the dominant conception of Ukrainian literature since Kotlяревsky's Aeneid. In fact, some Russian reviews seem to be under the spell of this perception. For example, in Assassin Shevchenko's Haidama, that is, Belinsky is not sure. He reads it and it should be, or it sounds somewhat funny, but he doesn't get it, he doesn't understand. He doesn't fully understand Ukrainian language, so he thinks it's grammatically incorrect, and he tries to figure out why is it zhinci in the dative, while in nominative it's zhinka as opposed to zhinca. So, but still, he wants to read it in the mold of Kotlяревщина, but something doesn't fit there, and the ultimate reaction is get rid of it. It's bad. It's to be dispelled and demystified. Now, why was Kvitka crying about Hrebinka's Ukrainian translation of Poltava? It's not particularly sentimental. It's actually, it's not a very successful translation because it is affected by Kotlяревщина. And the mode of reading that Kvitka applied to Hrebinka, it's the mode the tear-jerking mode that Kvitka himself employs in his own texts, his tale of idealized Marusia, for example. So we should not be surprised too much that Kvitka's encounter with Shevchenko is described in his letters as powerful catharsis, and his reaction reported back to Shevchenko in a letter is more than a sentimental cliche. I quote, "And then," so we were reading it, "and then my wife and I began to, my goodness, my hair, of which there is so little on my head, stood on end. My heart ached, my eyes turned blurry. I check and see my dear wife is wiping her eyes with a kerchief." So that's the emotional, immediate response, and this is the effect of native word. And sometimes it's irrelevant how sophisticated or how aesthetically, whether it's really serious or not, but the word, the language itself produces this effect. And to a degree, it can be connected with certain shift in understanding of cultural, national, or even historical agency. If in the previous generations, agency is associated with Cossack leaders, Cossack wars, the generation of the early 1800s realizes, well, politically we cannot have the same Cossackdom as in the past. This is all nostalgic, this is all gone. But now, a different kind of agency emerges, a different kind of charisma emerges. And this charisma is of word, of language, native language. So as one of the critics and writers of that generation put it, the age of Cossackdom in the fields of battles, this age is gone. The new era has come of the Cossackdom sung with the harmonious music of a bandura or lira. And so this is the reorientation. Now, it's not the Khmelnytsky or the hetman or the historical leader or the Cossack commander that heralds and embodies action and historical agency. Now it's the poet who could summon the energies, who could reveal charisma, that is a gift that is recognized by his immediate milieu as something special, something that brings communion, catharsis, revelation. So reading as a revelation. So Shevchenko's poetry, of course, it satisfied the cultural needs. Of course, there were tears about the fate of poor Katerina, but reading of Shevchenko also came as revelation to his immediate colleagues and readers. Kostomarov, his friend and colleague and member of Cyril Methodius Brotherhood group, recalled that when Shevchenko read his unpublished poems, the poems that caused him much harm, he reported the following, I quote, "All took over me. I saw how his muse tore the veil of the life of the people. It was at once terrifying and sweet, painful and enchanting to peek there. Taras's muse broke some subterranean chamber, locked for several centuries, covered with earth, to hide from the descendants even the mere memory of this place. Taras's muse entered this void with inextinguishable light and opened it up to the sun's rays." End of quote. Kurish, another colleague, in retrospect, summarized the prophetic impact of Shevchenko on the young generation of Ukrainian intelligentsia, striving for national renaissance, in the following words: "Shevchenko's songs were, for the nationally minded youth, like an archangel's trumpet summoning for resurrection. He appeared among us as a justification sent from above for our aspirations." So again, we have this notion of a poet that acquires the role of a national leader, or that charismatic role that is instantly recognized as mobilizing force for the entire society. Such recollections and descriptions underscore a new romantic vision of Ukraine, an ideology which replaced the earlier concept of historical charisma, based on Cossack ideology and historiography. This revelation, of course, could be quite uncomfortable. The revelation of poetic Ukraine could cause fear in the listener, and several interesting examples. One of them comes from Shevchenko's brother Vartholomei, who could not understand really Haidamaki as they were read out loud to him. So he was asking for certain, and he reports, "I could not fully understand it." And yet he ends up crying listening to it, and asks his brother not to do so, not to write these poems anymore. Another example of discomfort is described by Oskachensky, who was at the time in Kiev a clerk at the governor's office. And he is so uncomfortable with Shevchenko's poems, which are uncomfortable, which are political. This is the poems for which he was imprisoned. He is so uncomfortable that he finds a good excuse, calls his servant to call him out of the room because he just cannot stand it, because he's put on the spot. What is he supposed to do after that? Report to the police or elsewhere? So it's an interesting example of the effect that Shevchenko has on society. But generally speaking, what happens with Kobzar became an instant success, partly due to the poetic quality of Shevchenko, partly due to certain topics such as Katerina, narrative poems that appealed to noble ladies, that also poems about Cossacks, Cossack history, and Shevchenko became widely lionized by Ukrainian Cossack society in the 1840s. But again, that reading, that revelation, that catharsis could shift and become reading as revolt, reading as realization and recognition and call to reaction to the status quo, to the situation that Ukrainian society is found itself in. This power of reading as spiritual and political mobilization can also be documented through the materials of the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood. One of such readers was a teenager, Andruski, who read Shevchenko, then produced a lot of imitative poetry like Shevchenko and beyond. But generally, we see how he reads and how it affects him. First, he reads history of those people, which is supposed to be generally politically correct. But when Andruski reads it, he writes the following. When I read it, I swore to myself not to write in Russian anymore. And when my friend Posada, also a member of Cyril and Methodius, asked me if I could go to war with the Russians today, I answered, I wouldn't go against them in their lands, but in my motherland, I cannot guarantee. Now, this is 1840s. This is completely out of, this sounds wacky, actually. To this sentence, Posada smiles. He was older, wiser, quote unquote, and says, you know what, let's talk about Hetman Khmelnytsky. After the arrest of the members of Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, Andruski repented under the investigation, but during his exile in the northern areas of the Russian Empire, the old modes of reading, the old ideologies still haunted him, and he again got caught. But reading as a revolt, something that Shevchenko generated, is not only emotional catharsis, not only the sense of community, but also a sense of mobilization that would acquire certain political overtones. And that is also part of Shevchenko's impact on society and his lasting impact throughout the 19th century up until today. And we'll see some examples as well. Reading as identity maintenance and image control. Here, you know what, I'll have to skip some of these elements because we don't have that much time. But reading Ukrainian product, whether in Ukrainian or Russian, could stimulate a reader to admit his own identity. In certain cases, again, there are not too many of them, but some of them I found quite striking. A person working in censorship committee, Komovsky, who was fully integrated, Little Russian, integrated into St. Petersburg society, was writing to a brother of famous Russian poet Yazykov upon reading Gogol's Dikanka stories. So he reads these stories about Ukraine and then has to admit, you know what, I'm Ukrainian. Even though I don't know Ukrainian language, I'm far removed from it, but this world of witches and all kind of sorcery and fantasy truly appeals to my soul. And by doing it, Komovsky makes a sharp distinctions and differentiate, says, I really like Dikanka stories as opposed to Pushkin stories, Belkin stories, which are not that funny, not that entertaining, just and at that moment he calls Pushkin Moskal. In a very, again, it's a very unusual private context of making a boundary with help or stimulation with a text that is received or accepted as Ukrainian, Dikanka stories, and separating yourself in a joke. Of course, it's a joke. Everything is a joke there in this letter, but separating yourself as a reader, as a member of community, from Pushkin, the chief Russian poet of the time. And similar examples we find, for example, when a critic reviewing a poem on Bogdan Khmelnytsky suddenly admits that he is a Little Russian himself. So there are these elements that can be traced when a reader of Ukrainian product, whether it's Ukrainian, Russian language, nonetheless recognizes the message is mine and I belong to this community. So these are some of the examples that I'm trying to trace through correspondence or sources that are usually doesn't come to the very surface of the discourse. It's not something that is directly published, but it can be traced. And reading as writing, writing as reading. In Ukrainian tradition, reading and writing are connected in a very peculiar way because of the, as you might recall, there was a prohibition of publishing Ukrainian books since Peter the Great. There was an imperial control over what's published in Ukrainian territories. And this is why Ukrainian literature of the 18th century is manuscript literature. Kotlяревsky's Aeneida was not designed by Kotlяревsky to be published, at least not in 1798 when it appeared without his consent or knowledge in Petersburg with sponsorship of Parpura. So most of these texts circulated as manuscripts. If you want to read, you have to write, you have to copy it. It's a manuscript culture. Of course, it limits how many copies would circulate, but on the other hand, you would have this intimate connection with the text which you copy and memorize. So that's one aspect of reading and writing. The other aspect is that as you read, as you copy, you would be stimulated to write yourself as an imitation or uncondemned to what you see. And there are texts, there are corpuses, they were published in the 20th century of those imitators or those who, upon reading Ukrainian texts, or just because they wanted to, who took up pen and started writing their own. So this is an interesting field, even though it is institutionally very, very limited, because there is only so many books you can publish in Ukrainian, and it is an expensive thing to publish books and then hope to sell them to the audience, and not too many books were commercially successful in Ukrainian context. But it continues, and people through copying, memorization, and imitating, it continues. Ukrainian literature continues to expand. Now, at this point, I'll have to fast forward, because we can talk about these aspects of reading and what was published, what remained in the manuscript for a long time. But I would like to fast forward to contemporary readings of Shevchenko. And we can even say or state that the history of modern Ukraine, or modern Ukrainian consciousness, national identity, cultural identity, is a history of reading. And I would say not only that, but history of reading Shevchenko and history of misreading Shevchenko by revolutionaries and conservatories, by various groups and various participants. And Shevchenko is read today ever so avidly, powerfully, and intensely. Shevchenko could be read in various ways. Here we see, before the Maidan, how Shevchenko is used by what today, well, he will go into history as with several footnotes, but here we see Yanukovych, the reader. Whether he actually read Shevchenko, I would not necessarily confirm, but in this picture, he is posing as an avid reader of Shevchenko. What he actually read, we have other ideas. He actually liked, or he promoted poetry which combines the blatny genre, that is erotic, popular, lowbrow styles. But playing with this facade image, a Ukrainian revolutionary takes that same image, well, the same character Yanukovych, and uses Shevchenko's word, rephrasing them to criticize and capture Yanukovych as the object of sharp criticism of the ruler who forgot about his land, his people, his country. This is a rephrasing of Shevchenko's Rus, and instead of Pope, we have Yanukovych as as a pig on a throne. With Yanukovych, there is also a very interesting clip where Yanukovych and Putin are discussing the celebration of 200 years anniversary of Shevchenko. And it is, I'm not going to show you that clip, but it is worth looking at how they, or worth observing what they are saying and how they behave. The body language is remarkable. Yanukovych is saying, it's in the middle of that famous interview where Putin pledged billions to support Yanukovych's regime, and somewhere in the middle they discussed the celebration together of the 200 years anniversary of Shevchenko. And Yanukovych says, yeah, I cannot but underscore that we already created a program that you examined and approved. He is addressing it to Putin. Because this is a poet who unites our people in many ways. A prophet who saw so much, and he refers to the sufferings of Shevchenko, and bequested us so much. To which Putin replies, yeah, you mentioned the anniversary. Our colleagues also have done and worked in this sphere. But the discomfort that both express discussing this event is palpable. It's just uncanny how they cannot sit straight on their chairs talking about, so what are they going to celebrate? Which text are they going to read out loud or quote? And it's not surprising that actually 200 years anniversary of Shevchenko coincided with utilization of Shevchenko for political purposes. And this is still before the Maidan. We see in Shevchenko's utilizations in contemporary art, Shevchenko as an artist, as an icon, and as a writer. Here, Serhiy Kolyada uses Shevchenko's self-portrait with a candle, and Shevchenko's image of Bayrushi, that is orphans and beggars in Kazakhstan when he was in exile. And this is imposed, counterposed on the image of contemporary Ukraine, commercialized, capitalistic, with Shevchenko holding a bottle of Coke, and Bayrushi here represent the poverty and social injustice in Ukraine. Same painter dedicates his work, Welcome to Ukraine, to the Euro in soccer, European Championship. Shevchenko is depicted here as fixture of this carpet, rolled for every visitor to Ukraine, with a little inscription, horror. We see here, I guess you recognize Yulia Tymoshenko. At that point she was still in prison, depicted as Shevchenko's Katerina, with a sense of irony, of course. We see distorted head of Yushchenko. Yanukovych, who promises pokrashchenya, the improvement of life, the symbol of Eurocup, Klitschko brothers, and the whorehouse of Ukraine. So Shevchenko is used to produce this, to transform these iconic images, the image of Katerina, and reinforce the image of disorder in Ukraine and poverty in Ukraine. But of course, Shevchenko during the Maidan revolt and revolution is very, very present through words, through images. Here we see how Maidan acquires its own Shevchenko. And I don't know who the sculptor is, but somebody knows it by heart, how to shape Shevchenko. And so it's done. Shevchenko becomes part of revolutionary slogans during the Revolution of Dignity, as we know it today. And the 200 years anniversary is, the symbol marks various places in the Maidan and around the Maidan, from fences to walls and so on. And one of the latest visual incarnations of Shevchenko as the revolutionary, produced probably a few months ago, Hryhorovych is proti, Hryhorovych is against. So the image of Shevchenko is part of the crowd who is protesting and fighting the corrupt authorities. Slogans, words of Shevchenko, and Shevchenko as participant of the so-called Leninopad, all of this becomes part of the revolutionary transformation of Ukraine and how Shevchenko is utilized in these transformations. One of the most interesting projects, though, of celebrating Shevchenko's anniversary was Serhiy Proskurnya's project, 365 Days with Shevchenko. So during this anniversary year, he took interviews with 365 people, and each of these persons recited something from Shevchenko, either by heart or not. But it's a wonderful, if you get to this site, you'll see a wonderful sort of gallery of people of various generations, various orientations, ideological, even artistic, some ironic, some serious, various professions, reading out loud Shevchenko. And of course Shevchenko becomes part of visual culture. He is reclaimed again as an icon, as a hero, as a cliche. And here we see Andriy Yermolenko's sequence of images of Shevchenko. Superman, Shevchenko as the cop who's looking after this incident, again, as a mean of criticizing the corruption in Ukraine. And here Shevchenko is Buddha, but the context is critical, because the quote says, "Oh, we are so enlightened, and we want to enlighten other people and show what the truth is to all others." But in reality, this image contains a significant dose of irony. And Shevchenko is the king of Ukraine, modeled on his self-portrait of 1838. Here we see other examples, and this group of young artists, they are now in Kiev, but they are from various areas, including Donetsk or Kiev region or Western Ukraine. Dmytro Kryshkovsky produces, counterposes Shevchenko, the image, the icon, with the commercial culture. So his image is called Taras Adidas. This picture, which I received a couple of days ago, is from Kharkiv, and it's an example of reshaping of Ukraine, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian space at the time of war by finding that positive image, positive icon. And here we see the largest portrait of Shevchenko painted on the wall. So today in Ukraine you have this contest: who will produce the largest flag of Ukraine, or who will sing the anthem in the largest assembly, or who would, again, the largest, the biggest. So here we have still the comments to this fact are all very positive. What a beautiful image, everyone replies. I wish in every city of Ukraine there would be such image. Again, it's an attempt to consolidate Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian image around something that is positive and could be accepted as aktualne, that is, it's relevant, it's true, it's about liberty, it's about humanity, and this is what we see in those images. And of course we see other, this is Ivan Semesyuk, which is known as master of zhlob art that debunks the stereotypes, myths, including Shevchenko or including folk art, and he plays a lot of fun with this. So here we see Shevchenko as Beth Terry, or quotation from Shevchenko: everyone has his own fate, his own road, but here this is connected with the terrors, and it's an ironic way of Ukrainization or Ukrainian culture by force or by terror, which excesses happen there as well, and those who follow the development of Ukrainian revolution over the past year or half a year would know that there are provocations or ways that alienate broad circles. You know what Farion is doing occasionally, and you always scratch your head why. And I think this is Semesyuk's treatment of this echt Ukrainianization. And I think this is it. So we continue reading Shevchenko. Shevchenko is not going anywhere, and the only hope would be that we'll actually be reading Shevchenko, and whichever mode will be engaged in our reading, it will certainly become part of reshaping of contemporary Ukraine, its legacy, making it relevant, encompassing, and new European Ukrainian identity in the making. So thank you for your attention.
Questions? May I start?
Sure.
My understanding is that Kaptazar was arrived not only in Moscow and Petersburg, right, in 1800s. How it was perceived in what may also Austria, Ukraine in the 40s? Did it reach it despite the small number?
Yes, it did reach. It wasn't that easy.
Could you repeat the question, please?
The question was about how Shevchenko was read not only in the Russian Empire, but whether he reached Ukrainians living in Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he did reach Ukrainians living in Austro-Hungarian Empire. As you know, that the younger generations of intelligentsia there, the so-called Trice, Ruska Trice, Shashkevich, Vahelevich, and Holovatsky, they published their Rusalka Dnistrova before Kobzar, but they represent intelligentsia who was avidly following what's happening in Ukraine. Folkloric collections, all this was collected and read, and certainly they responded to Shevchenko, and there are some imitations of his poetry. So it did reach Austro-Hungarians. Any other questions?
Can you tell a little bit more about the perception of Shevchenko's text in postmodern Ukrainian literature?
Whoa, this would be a different talk.
Okay.
But postmodern or postmodernist, there are several ways of rereading Shevchenko. Some of them start with reintegration of Western scholarship in Ukraine, with Hrabovich's book, which was translated into Ukrainian in the early 90s, and then provoked further discussions. Hrabovich is still quite active publishing on Shevchenko, but Shevchenko is an industry. So during Yushchenko era, during Yanukovych, it's a particular academic and publishing industry that you have to maintain it. And there's quite a bit that is going on. For example, there were 2 attempts to produce his full collected works. One of them has failed. The other one is actually moving quite. All the written works are published in a decent edition now, but the artworks are not yet. We have volume number 7, only the first volume of 6 blend volumes. And there will be tricks, because there are some images, for example, of naked Shevchenko, as you know, the scandalous image of Shevchenko in the Kazakh steppe, walking with his, his penis is showing. He's wearing some kind of a cape. And it's an interesting, ironic image of a poet in exile. But that image is a bit too hard for Ukrainian public, or especially academic institutions, to stomach and receive. This is normal. A poet who looks at himself, depicts himself, and has sense of irony and distance from himself. So these aspects, but there are so many books, there are so many publications right now that we are just looking at the tip of the iceberg. But yeah.
Before in the previous question, I would like to ask maybe 2 questions. First, you mentioned that now Shevchenko is again a figure, kind of symbolic, meaning around which we are trying to build, to reshape this narrative. And what makes him special? Because there are some thoughts that we again like giving to the past, like reshaping all these archaic or traditional identities. So why do they again pick up this figure? Because studying his real life doesn't approach us to the understanding of why he became such an archetypal figure for Ukrainian identity, and why do we again recall this image and again reactualize it during these events. And the second question is, till recently, his figure was very stable, sacred, like carved in marble. even the image, even how he looks,
Right.
how he is represented, and now all these illustrations, which are brilliant, thank you. What are the social effects of reshaping this visual image of Shevchenko? What are the consequences of kind of modernizing Taras, of making him super modern? Thank you.
I'll start with the second question. I think these are positive signs of treating Shevchenko in a normal way, that is, without locking him into preconceived meaning or preconceived role that is inherited whether from the 19th century or Soviet times. Shevchenko the idol, Shevchenko the fur-headed creature with dark eyes, and Shevchenko becomes more young in some of these images, and of course some of them are a little bit attempts to turn him into erotic figure. I've heard some of those looking at him as an attractive young man are interesting, even though not all of them are particularly successful. Some of them are still a little bit primitive, but at least opening up of Shevchenko's image to all kind of transformations and not being afraid of irony or counterposing, that's a positive sign. But whether it will become the prevailing mode of reading Shevchenko, dealing with Shevchenko, remains to be seen. But as long as we can read Shevchenko in an open way, the way this project reads him, you can read him in any possible way. You do not have to lock him, because once you do so, Shevchenko is gone, and you're dealing with monuments. As to the first question, and sorry, the first question.
It was about Shevchenko as the basis of new contemporary Ukrainian national identity.
The archives or the
well,
relevance of it.
traditional, something like looking back.
And my answer to this would be, maybe he's not so archaic, maybe he's not so traditional. And you could see it, how he can be read, if you watch the Maidan, if you watch that first set of confrontations when Serhiy Nihoyan, the Armenian revolutionary who was one of the first who were shot by the police. And one of the first videos was he reads excerpt from Shevchenko's Kavkaz, and certain texts of Shevchenko where we are talking about basic human universal values of liberty, of truth, they become so potent for those who protested at the Maidan. They became so true that the slogan, God is with us is truth and power and holy liberty, and probably quite a bit of public realized that these words still stand for something. It's not just cliches, it's not just embroidered testament in a frame. There is meaning that can be absorbed into contemporary life and contemporary struggle to reshape Ukraine as a normal country. So that would be my answer, that suddenly I think the generations will discover that this is not just archaic, this is not, that there are layers or there are words in Shevchenko that can appeal to us directly, and we would not even feel that they're written 200 years ago. Yeah?
I'd like to know your opinion about my understanding this historical contempt. Actually, when, as you said, when Ukraine was integrated to Russia, uses the diplomatic term, actually was occupied or lost all autonomy. So basically, this territory, which has a Ostrog Academy founded in 16th century, Kiev-Mogila Academy 17th century, was integrated into territory of Russia, which I'm not sure if any educational, intellectual center existed at that time in Russia. So, and this intelligentsia in next generation actually lost all Ukrainian identity, and they was reading Shevchenko is revealing some their lost memory, and some of them enjoying, some of them cannot stand it. So how it can happen this, what's wrong with
What's wrong with Ukrainians? Okay.
And then now basically modern approach of Kremlin that everything which is related to Ukraine is inferior, it's a peasants.
Okay. Now, I don't want to separate everything into white and black. So there was I wouldn't call it, well, occupation is happening today. At that time, I would call it integration maybe, for now at least. But because what I mean, that these members of Ukrainian elites, and they were influential in the shaping of policies within the empire, and making sure that they make it there, and they are privileged to a degree to occupy their space in the Russian Empire. So when they were admitted into Russian hereditary gentry, their dreams came through. But there is that conundrum of Ukrainian history that is inescapable. Why were they admitted to Ukrainian hereditary gentry? That was based on their ancestry, on their history, on their grandfathers who were Cossacks, who fought Poles, sometimes Tatars, sometimes Muscovite, and who were trying to establish their own autonomy, separated from, or destroyed from within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the mid-17th century. So there is this always conundrum. They are there because, and they are hereditary Russian gentry, they are comfortable, they are secure, but they are there also because of their past. So what do they do with it? That past is the essence of their identity, their pride, their dignity, their social, cultural capital that they try to position. But that very cultural and social capital is inevitably being relegated to footnotes of Russian imperial narrative or Russian imperial national projects, if you look at the construction of histories, for example. And the history of Little Russia becomes a little but a footnote to the mainstream of Ustrialov, for example, where Khmelnytsky is just the agency is not Khmelnytsky's at all, it's the agency of Alexei Mikhailovich, who kindly agrees to take Khmelnytsky under his wing. Of course, this doesn't make them comfortable, and we see those nostalgic attempts to revive or relive that past, which is glorious, which is the reason why I am a nobleman, why I have my dignity, why I have my status. So it's inescapable. You're one with the empire, with its social estate, privileged estate, but you're also there because of the past, which you keep remembering and in some ways rehearsing or reinforcing. And that also brings us to the notion of Khmelnytsky and Mazepa. The curse of Mazepa is there, and Mazepanism and treason is the other side of mimicry of Ukrainian intellectuals and intelligentsia as they try to behave in a proper political way, but they also know that they are watched as a potential other, and that's the inevitable effect of mimicry. But mimicry is everywhere. If you look at what is written and how it's written, you would see those examples. Yes?
So in that light, do you think that all of that work that you showed on one of the early slides about the folklore collection that was being done in the 30s and the 40s, ethnography, folklore, etc., that's pretty early for the Russian Empire. The Russians weren't doing a whole lot more collecting of their ethnography than the ones that you listed there, and it seems to me that maybe that's a somewhat safe way to define Ukrainian. You can't go really study the Cossacks, it's too political, but if you go and you study songs and myths and folklore and things like that, then you're building up something uniquely Ukrainian that can maybe be said to be politically safe for the first half of the 19th century.
I would agree with that. It's also I think 1830s is more of a romantic syncretic era when Ukrainian material could be positioned as part of this larger imperial project of bringing all the cultures and transforming them into a uniquely Russian imperial project, because we have our own south, our own north, we have those Caucasians, exotic people, we have Siberia, and we have Ukrainians. So they could become this umbrella culture, a gift, a translation from Russian Empire, aspiring to cultural greatness as the political diplomatic greatness is achieved after Napoleonic success, and they are now mighty empire, but we need now to show our cultural accomplishment and be part of enlightened nations. So that could be the project, and in the late 1820s, early 30s, that was the project, and Ukrainian songs were attractive, and you're absolutely right, they were published before Russian, not completely, because there were some collections of Russian songs in the late 18th century, but the romantic folklore appears, Ukrainian romantic folklore appears first, and for a little while, until maybe late 30s, it is looked at as an example. Why don't we Russians have something like this? But again, it can be still ours. Before the Polish uprising, even Mickiewicz could be read. Polivoy certainly reads him as such, as Mickiewicz could be ours, because he belongs to Russian Empire and he's a great European poet. So we can bring him in. He can be one of the fixtures of our great multi-umbrella romantic culture. Of course, it all changes as Polish uprising puts an instant stop to that. And toward the end of the 30s, Ukrainian project becomes a little bit more cumbersome. And it's very indicative in the case of Shevchenko, because reviews of Shevchenko in Russian criticisms are very interesting. Polivoy, who was a sympathizer of Ukraine, produces a very negative review. Negative not in terms that he denies Shevchenko's talent, but he directly addresses the poet, telling him, why are you distorting language and thought by writing in Ukrainian? While the same Polivoy is very positive to second-rate, third-rate Ukrainian products, such as I showed the cover of Chari, one of those plays that are folkloric. As long as it's folkloric, as long as it's naive in Schiller-and way, it's fine. As long as it doesn't deal with history, civilization, translation, it's fine. But once Ukrainian product becomes a little more sophisticated or a bit more highbrow or more powerful, Polivoy instantly sensed it as subversion. And not only he, another Gogol's schoolmate, Kukelnik, second-rate, now forgotten, but at the time, the 30s, very famous Russian writer, dramatist, whose play Torquato Tasso was a staple of the Imperial Theater. He, upon reading Shevchenko's Kobzar, there was nothing politically wrong with Kobzar in 1840, but he already sensed there, this is a вредная книга, this is a harmful book, it should be banned, along with Polish books or German books in the Russian Empire. So you see those interests, and Kukelnik is from Ukraine, so we have various kinds of scenarios adopted, internalized, realized by people from Ukraine and not from Ukraine.
Let us thank our guest for a wonderful talk.